Does circumcision, and especially like male circumcision, and I know we know about female genital mutilation, and but specifically about this because this is so much more accepted among the majority of Jewish people, even secular Jews, and the majority of Muslim people. Is does was that was the inhibition of sexuality a driver in that, or was it just sort of loyalty to the sort of the local leaders? I mean, because you write about this a little bit in your book, and I know that they say that if you circumcise, then little boys are less likely to masturbate, which is a hypothesis that I debunked quite copiously, like when I was growing up. But it's absolutely not true. But it somehow prevents it. But
most cultures do not circumcise males or females, but there are a lot of cultures that have over the course of time and history and cultures. And there's different forms of circumcision. As we know, some are really bad. I mean, all are bad basically, but they vary quite a bit in the practice. The fact about circumcision, especially in North America, is that it wasn't practiced in North America until the 1920s. In Europe, circumcision is
Kellogg.
Exactly. Kellogg, Dr. Kellogg of Kellogg's cereal, and his myth, and he propagated this myth, was that boys who are circumcised won't masturbate as much, which is again tied, and it was religious. The guy was religious as hell. He was married, but he probably never had sex. I mean, this guy was really screwed up in the head sexually. And he's telling everybody else to circumcise boys. It's a part of that narrative that comes out of the very first chapter of the Bible, that your body is your enemy and you have to control your body. And if you don't, you're a failure in the eyes of God. So it's got all that. It's got everything we need to create a guilt cycle, if you will. And masturbation. So what the religion is trying to do is trying to say your body's your enemy, so we're going to cut part of it off so it won't be as much of your enemy. And that's kind of the attitude that some people that I think came out of it. But let's go back to Armin's point earlier. These are memes. These are evolving just like the coronavirus evolves. And why it began is really lost to history and lost to time. So, Ali, I have no idea how the first circumcision came about or why it was so successful, but I do know it propagates rather well today and has for centuries in some places like Israel and Judaism. And it is propagated for centuries in Islam too. And female genital mutilation has propagated for centuries. I mean, it's a horrible practice, but I want to think about this. We'll get back to Islam because I want to target Islam briefly, if I may. I'm an expert on Christianity, but I'm also pretty knowledgeable about Islam. I think we mentioned trauma and religious trauma. We see religion creating trauma in children at very early ages. Now, if you take and tell a child your body's your enemy, you're dirty, you're filthy, and all that from a very early age, and they grow up believing that. Oh, and then at about 12 years of age, you give them a party saying this is going to be a thing you're going to do for God, and you cut off their genitals and mutilate their genitals, male or female, at 12 years old with no anesthesia. Do you think that might traumatize somebody? So here's my contention. Cultures that circumcise run the risk, if not the certainty, of traumatizing virtually every person in that culture. So if you look at circumcising cultures, I'm going to suggest that there is an inordinate amount of trauma in those cultures that's directly related to sex and directly related to circumcision.
They can't stop fighting each other in Israel, the Muslims and the Jews.
Exactly. So I think it's kind of a wild hypothesis on my part, and I'm not saying I've got scientific evidence for it, but I think I've got a lot of observations. I think people get traumatized fairly early in life by the treatment they're given by their parents, by their families, by their communities. And if that treatment includes being extremely sex negative and even genital mutilation for boys or girls, then you're just adding trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And those people are never going to get over that trauma in their lifetime. And they're going to propagate that to their children, and they're going to propagate it onto their communities, and they're going to have wars with other communities based upon that trauma. That's kind of my pet theory about some of what's going
it's
on.
Torture. You're torturing, you're
agree with
sexually
you.
torturing your own infants.
Exactly. And don't tell anybody an infant 8 days old getting circumcised isn't getting body memories. There's something going on there.
But even if they didn't remember, like imagine if I went and like kidnapped an adult and tortured them with a knife and then wiped their memory and be like, hey, it's not a crime anymore because he doesn't remember. Well, I mean, you tortured somebody. That person went through hell through your. I mean, and that would be a huge crime. That would be headline news if I did this to an adult. But apparently, if you do it to a helpless infant that they cannot defend themselves, all of a sudden it becomes a-okay.
Right. In the name of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can't really erase that kind of memory just technically because that's
But even if you did, it will still be torture.
No,
Yeah.
that's of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.